Ray, I'm only going to ask you this because you're my good friend. What is truth?
No good friend would ask such a difficult question as that. I'm just about to wash my hands. But anyway, it seems to me that the whole notion of truth has gone through a very rough period. I mean, the philosophers, first of all, the people who caused it a considerable amount of damage, particularly in the 20th century. I mean, Ramsay, the great Cambridge philosopher who died young, famously said, to assert that P and to assert that P is true is to assert the same thing. So the little predicate is true is entirely redundant. So he was the father of the minimalist approach to truth, that there's nothing in truth at all. Of course, there are much older conceptions of truth. The correspondence theory, the idea that in its most recent form is to assert that snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. I mean, the most easy way of thinking about truth is of the correspondence between assertions and states of affairs out there. That's always difficult because the assertions and the states of affairs are not clearly separate. Those states of affairs are picked out by the assertions. That's what made people pretty anxious about the correspondence theory of truth. The other theory is a coherence theory, the idea that a particular proposition is true if it coheres with other propositions, and that scientific truth, for example, is a great mountain of coherent propositions of larger and larger generality. And the third notion, of course, most famously from your own country, is pragmatism, the notion that truth is that which essentially works. And that's been picked up by evolutionary theorists as well, that basically our conceptions of truth are simply things that help us to survive, help us to plug more comfortably into our environment. So that's
all of these seem true in their own way.
I think they are, and I think the truth about truth is very complex, and namely that correspondence probably is one of the fundamental building blocks of truth. But clearly coherence is another part. Correspondent truths have to cohere, and that clearly what truths we pick out depends on what we're interested in. So to some extent, pragmatism has a part to play. But of course, the minimalists are right as well, because if you think of truth as a stuff, or there being a single truth to which all propositions converge, or if you think of truth as a predicate, then you're going to be very disappointed. So the minimalists have got it right as well. They've all got little aspects of the notion of truth. The people who've got it completely wrong are the relativists, those who say there is no such thing as truth, because, as has been pointed out endlessly, although they've never noticed, that essentially they have undermining their own position. The assertion that there is no truth is obviously a general truth, or a claim to a general truth, which is greater than most of the truths most of us can actually subscribe to.
Those attacks on relativism by it being internally inconsistent or contradictory, I think is a cheap shot, because it's something you can say about a lot of things, and that won't work for me too strongly. The argument of the relativist is that because we can only know things through our senses and our brains and ourselves, that we are arrogant to assume that what we are sensing about the world is the world in reality.
Let me pick up one of your observations. We can only know things through our brains. What's the status of that truth?
Generally a materialistic worldview, that the perceptions we have, the only things we know about reality, come from our senses, and from perhaps a logical deduction in mathematics or other parts of logic. So one argument is that unless you're getting something logically or through your senses, we really can't know anything about it.
We can set aside logical truths because they don't deliver more. Basically what you put in your starter pack is just as big as what you get at the end.
Sure.
But let's focus on this general empirical assertion that you've made, that we only know things through our brains and our senses. And I would like to ask you, how do we know that we know things only through our brains and senses? Where do we get this sense of only from?
Mm-hmm. Well, the argument is that the burden of proof is on the other side, because the brain and our senses are all that we see through. I mean, it's self-evident, and if that's not the case, then it's up to you to show me why.
But I have no problem that, if you took away my body, I wouldn't be in receipt of much information. All of that I'm perfectly happy about. But I'm not ensuring how you can conclude from that we cannot arrive at objective truths.
Because what the relativist says is that because we are using our mental capacity to discern the world, we are bringing to that world our own biases and prejudices, and the simple demonstration of that is look at visual illusions that you see on paper, where you see it two different ways and it flips around, and the paper's not changing.
There you go, you see.
Our brains are interpreting it in different ways. So if the outside world's not changing, but we see it, isn't that not make us be a little bit humble in terms of our seeing absolute objective truth on the world?
But the fact that we can see that an illusion is an illusion, and that, for example, I don't think you sitting in front of me is an illusion, whereas if I saw two of you, because I had taken some tablets, then clearly I would think it was an illusion. So in other words, most of our experiences are not illusory in that sense. The argument from illusion that because some experiences are illusory means that all experiences are illusory, I think can be easily refuted. As Gilbert Ryle said, you cannot have counterfeit coins if you don't have a coinage that's produced in the proper way. He also used the word bias. The very concept of a bias shows that we're able, as it were, to recover from our narrow perspectives, that we gradually extend beyond those narrow perspectives. So it's to the point where we actually have a science that's built up a set of statements that actually looks quite different, sees the world quite differently from the data we get from our sense perception.
So how do you conclude? What is your overall concept on the reality of objective truth?
I think there are objective truths, and the fact that I'm mortal, for example, is an objective truth. The fact that you're sitting over there is an objective truth. I can think of large numbers of objective truths about the geography of England or the history of the world and so on, which doesn't mean to say that I won't focus on certain things that are interesting to me. For me at the moment, the most important thing about the geography of England is the distance between Manchester and London. For many other people, they'll have a different view. So often we will pick out things that are interest relative, but it doesn't mean to say those things we pick out are necessarily subordinated to our interests. There are sets of objective truths. There are truths about the geography of England, there are truths about the planetary system, there are truths about the amount of potassium in people's bodies and so on and so forth. All of these are objective truths. Which truths we focus on depends very much on our interests, but it doesn't mean to say those truths are utterly subordinate to our interests. I may be interested in the level of my potassium in my blood, but it doesn't mean to say that it isn't 4.2 as opposed to 6.8.